They switched it. 3 words whispered by a child that would stop a $9 billion betrayal in its tracks. Most people in this glass tower look at Kim Ara and see nothing, just the daughter of a cleaning lady sitting quietly in the corner. To the men in expensive suits, she is invisible. But while they were busy betraying their leader, Ara was watching. She saw the green folder. She saw the hands tremble as the real contract was hidden away. Now, this 5-year-old girl is about to do the one thing no grown man in this building dares to do: tell Lee Hyun-Woo, the most feared mafia boss in the city, that he's being robbed by his own blood. Stay with us, because what happens when the smallest voice in the room exposes a $9 billion lie will change everything. Welcome to a story of courage, betrayal, and a truth that no amount of money can hide. Kim Hyejin's day began long before the sun touched the glass spires of Seoul. To the world, she was a shadow in a crisp white apron, a woman whose presence was measured only by the absence of dust and the scent of lemon polish. At the Hyun-Woo International Group, the rules for someone like her were unwritten but absolute. Be efficient, be silent, and above all, be invisible. For years, Hyejin had navigated the cold, marble corridors of boss Lee Hyun-Woo's estate like a ghost, moving furniture and scrubbing floors without ever leaving a footprint. But today, the silence was harder to maintain. With the babysitter fallen ill and no one else to turn to, Hyejin's 5-year-old daughter, Ara, was tucked into the crook of her arm as they entered the service elevator. Ara was a burst of color in a world of monochrome, her eyes wide and curious, her spirit far too large for the narrow halls of the servants' quarters. Hyejin felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her chest as she set Ara down in a secluded corner of the 15th floor executive wing, far from the mahogany doors where the important people held court. Kneeling so their eyes were level, Hyejin took Ara's small hands in her own, her voice a desperate, soft plea. "Ara, listen to Mama," she whispered, smoothing the girl's hair. "This is a castle for giants, and we are just the mice. To stay safe, you must be a shadow. Do not speak. Do not run. You must be so quiet that even the air doesn't know you're here." Ara tilted her head, her lower lip trembling slightly. "Like a game of hide-and-seek, Mama?" "Yes, my love. But it's a game where the giants don't like to be found," Hyejin replied, her heart breaking at the necessity of a lesson. She had raised Ara on stories of truth and honor, but in this building, the truth was often a luxury they couldn't afford. Hyejin kissed her daughter's forehead one last time before standing up, adjusting her apron, and disappearing into the next room to begin her shift. Ara sat perfectly still, her legs swinging inches above the expensive carpet. She watched the light dance off the polished surfaces, imagining she was a secret princess guarding a glass kingdom. She practiced her invisibility, holding her breath whenever a heavy set of footsteps echoed nearby. She was a good girl. She would stay hidden, just as her mother asked. But as she watched the shadows lengthen across the floor, Ara didn't realize that the invisible corner her mother chose was about to become the front row seat to a $9 billion betrayal. Lee Hyun-Woo lived in a world of sharp edges and cold reflections. From his corner office on the top floor of the Hyun-Woo International Group headquarters, the city of Seoul looked less like a collection of souls and more like a vast, digital chessboard. To him, the building wasn't just made of steel and glass, it was built on the absolute precision of his will. He moved through the corridors like a predator in a silent forest, his footsteps barely making a sound on the polished marble that his staff spent hours scrubbing to a mirror shine. Yet, despite the thousands of people who facilitated his life, Hyun-Woo was effectively alone. To the great boss Lee, the people around him were little more than functional architecture. The security guards who bowed until their backs ached were merely gatekeepers. The secretaries who managed his frantic schedule were organic calendars, and the cleaning crew, like Kim Hyejin, were simply ghosts that ensured the world remained spotless for his arrival. He never looked at their faces, never memorized a name, and certainly never considered the lives they led once they stepped out of a shadow. In his mind, silence was the greatest sign of efficiency. If he didn't have to acknowledge a person's presence, it meant they were doing their job correctly. This glass fortress was a monument to his success, but it was also his cage. He had traded the warmth of human connection for the cold certainty of power. When he sat at his massive mahogany desk, he didn't see the fatigue in the eyes of the man delivering his coffee or the subtle tremor in the hand of a junior executive presenting a report. He only saw data, margins, and the $9 billion merger that promised to cement his legacy. He believed that by making himself unreachable, he made himself invincible. He had forgotten that a fortress, no matter how grand, is only as strong as the people who stand within its walls, the very people he had trained himself to overlook. He reigned over a kingdom of invisible subjects, never realizing that the most dangerous secrets are often hidden in the places one refuses to look. To Lee Hyun-Woo, the world was perfect because it was clinical, quiet, and entirely under his thumb, unaware that the silence of his fortress was about to be shattered by the one thing he had never accounted for, a child's simple, honest observation. The 15th floor of the Hyun-Woo International Group headquarters was a cathedral of glass and cold ambition, a place where even the air felt expensive and forbidden. For 5-year-old Ara, the vast hallway was a labyrinth of shadows and polished marble. She sat small and still in an oversized leather chair, her tiny legs swinging rhythmically, careful not to let her sneakers scuff the floor. Her mother, Hygiene, had whispered a final, desperate plea before vanishing with her cleaning cart. Be a shadow, Ara. Be invisible. Ara tried. She counted the lights on the ceiling and watched the late afternoon sun dance across the sleek surfaces, imagining she was a hidden princess in a fortress of crystal. But the silence of the corridor was suddenly shattered by the sharp, hurried rhythm of approaching footsteps. 2 men in impeccably tailored black suits rounded the corner. Ara recognized them from the portraits in the lobby. Jang Sung-ho and Oh Dae-sung, the boss's most trusted lieutenants. They moved with a frantic energy that felt wrong, their eyes darting nervously toward the elevators as if the walls themselves were watching. Hurry, the boss will be back from the gala at any moment, Sung-ho hissed, his voice strained and thin. He fumbled with a briefcase, his hands trembling so violently that the latches clicked like gunshots in the quiet hall. Dae-sung pulled out a vibrant green folder, the true contract that held the fate of a $9 billion empire. From the shadows of her chair, Ara watched, her breath hitching in her throat. She saw Sung-ho reach into his jacket and produce a stack of gray, dull-looking papers. With practiced, desperate speed, they ripped the original white documents from the green folder and stuffed them away, replacing them with the gray forgeries. He'll never know, Dae-sung whispered, a cruel, triumphant smirk flickering across his face as he smoothed the folder shut. To him, it's just another signature. They turned and marched past Ara, their expensive cologne trailing behind them like a cold fog. They didn't glance at her. To them, she was nothing more than a piece of office furniture, a part of the background that didn't matter. As the elevator doors chimed and swallowed the men, Ara remained frozen, her heart drumming against her ribs like a trapped bird. She didn't understand mergers or fraud, but she understood the look of a thief. She looked at the heavy office doors where the fake papers now waited for Boss Lee. Her mother's voice echoed in her mind. Always tell the truth, Ara. It's the only thing that belongs to you. The invisible girl took a deep, shaky breath, knowing that being a shadow was no longer an option. Ara huddled in the alcove, her small chest heaving as she watched the 2 men vanish into the elevator. The silence that followed was heavy, pressing down on her like the marble walls of the estate. In her mind, the image of the green folder was burned bright, the true contract she had seen snatched away and replaced by a lie. She looked down at her hands, which were small and trembling against her light-colored sweater. At 5 years old, Ara knew that the world was divided into 2 groups, the people who owned the glass towers and the people like her mother, Hygiene, who cleaned them while trying to remain invisible. Stay quiet, Ara. Be a shadow, her mother had whispered earlier that morning, a familiar plea born from the fear of losing the only job that kept them fed. But Hygiene had also taught her something else, a rule that felt much heavier than the rule of silence. Always tell the truth, Ara. A lie is a weight you can never put down. Now that weight felt like a mountain. Era looked toward the grand hallway where Boss Lee, the Lion of Seoul, would soon walk. He was a man who moved with a terrifying gravity, a man whose eyes never seemed to see the little girl in the hallway. To speak to him was to break the most important rule of her life. If she spoke, would the scary men come back for her? If she spoke, would her mother be angry that she had stopped being a shadow? The conflict tore at her. She thought of the men, Jang Sung-ho and Oh Dae-sung, with their sharp suits and sharper eyes, men who thought no one was watching. They were powerful, and she was so very small. But as she gripped the fabric of her sweater, her mother's voice drowned out the fear. To stay silent was to let the fake win. It was to let a betrayal worth $9 billion happen right in front of her. The elevator chimed, a sharp, cold sound that echoed through the lobby. Era knew the boss was coming. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She could stay in the darkness and remain the invisible daughter of a maid, or she could step into the light and honor the honesty her mother had sacrificed everything to teach her. Tears pricked her eyes, but she didn't wipe them away. The secret was too heavy to carry any further. As the polished shoes of Lee Hyun-Woo clicked against the floor, Era took a shaky breath and stepped out from behind the pillar. The shadow was gone. Only the truth remained. The heavy double doors of the boardroom groaned on their hinges, signaling the end of the wait. Era, tucked away behind a towering white marble pillar, felt her heart hammer against her ribs like a trapped bird. Her mother's instructions echoed in her mind. Be a shadow, be invisible, but the weight of the secret she carried was far heavier than her fear. Across the hall, the two men in the expensive suits emerged, their faces now masks of cool professional confidence, though Era noticed the way the tall one's hand twitched as he adjusted his tie. They held the red-striped folder tight against their chests, a stolen treasure hidden in plain sight. Then the elevator chimed. Lee Hyun-Woo stepped out, a man who moved with the silent, predatory grace of a lion. His dark eyes were fixed on his phone, his brow furrowed as he calculated figures that decided the fates of thousands. He was surrounded by a phalanx of security and lawyers, a wall of suits that made him look untouchable, a king in a glass castle. As he began his brisk walk toward the boardroom for the signing, the air in the hallway seemed to turn cold. Era looked at her mother, who was busy scrubbing a distant corner, her back turned to the powerful man she served. Then she looked at the two traitors, who were now bowing deeply to Boss Lee, a sickening display of false loyalty. Always tell the truth, baby girl. Always, her mother's voice whispered in her memory. Before her fear could paralyze her, Era stepped out from behind the pillar. Her small, light-colored sweater was a sharp contrast to the sea of black suits. She didn't run. She simply stood in the center of the polished marble path, her legs trembling but her gaze fixed. The entourage slowed, confused by the sudden obstacle. Boss Lee didn't look up at first, his thumb scrolling through a final report, until the silence of his men forced his eyes to lift. He stopped just feet away from her. The atmosphere became suffocatingly tense as the most feared man in Seoul looked down at the tiny, wide-eyed girl blocking his way. The two traitors froze, their faces turning a ghostly pale as they recognized the invisible child from the corner. Hyun-Woo's gaze was sharp, enough to make a grown man wither, but as he looked into Era's blue eyes, he saw a reflection of a purity he hadn't encountered in decades. He didn't see a nuisance. He saw a child screaming for help without making a sound. He slowly slid his phone into his pocket and crouched down, meeting her at eye level. "Why are you crying, little one?" he asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that was surprisingly gentle. Era took a shaky breath, her tiny hand reaching out to point at the red-striped folder. The words were a mere breath, but in the sudden vacuum of the hallway, they rang like a bell. "I saw them switch it," she whispered, her voice cracking with the effort of her bravery. "They said you'd never notice. They switched it." The words were so soft they were nearly swallowed by the hum of the building's massive air filtration system, but to Lee Hyun-Woo, they sounded like a thunderclap in the sterile silence of the hallway. He froze, the screen of his phone still glowing with a half-read message as the world around him seemed to tilt on its axis. In the high-stakes theater of Seoul's underworld, Hyun-Woo was a man who prided himself on seeing the invisible strings of every player, yet here was a 5-year-old girl in a $10 sweater pointing out a knot he had completely missed. He lowered himself onto one knee, the expensive fabric of his suit trousers pressing against the polished marble floor, a gesture of humility he hadn't afforded another soul in over a decade. He looked into Kim Ara's wide, trembling eyes and saw a purity of truth that didn't exist in his boardroom. "Tell me exactly what you saw, little one," he whispered, his voice losing its jagged edge. Ara's small hands gripped the edge of her seat as she described the two men, the tall, nervous one and the shorter one with the green folder. As she spoke of the gray papers being stuffed inside and the white papers disappearing into a jacket pocket, Hyun-Woo felt a wave of ice-cold clarity wash over him. The green folder contained the final, unredacted merger documents for the $9 billion deal he was scheduled to sign in exactly 20 minutes. A visceral shock jolted through his chest, followed quickly by a burning, silent rage. These weren't just any employees. Jang Sung-ho and Oh Dae-sung were men he had brought up through the ranks, men who had sat at his table and pledged their lives to the firm. The betrayal tasted like ash in his mouth. If this child hadn't been sitting in this exact corner, playing invisible, while the shark circled, he would have walked into that meeting and signed his own empire's death warrant. "They said you'd never notice," Ara added, a single tear finally escaping and rolling down her cheek. Hyun-Woo reached out, his large, scarred hand hovering for a moment before he gently placed it on her small shoulder. For the first time in years, the machine of Hyun-Woo International felt a human connection spark through the coldness of his ambition. "You are very brave to tell me," he said, his voice now like sharpened steel. He stood up, his gaze fixing on the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall where his executioners were waiting with a pen and a lie. The betrayal was exposed, the predator was now the prey, and it was all because a maid's daughter had refused to look away. The heavy oak doors of Lee Hyun-Woo's private suite swung open with a slow, ominous creak. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and the cold, clinical smell of ozone from the high-end air purifiers. At the center of the room stood the massive mahogany desk, where two men waited with forced smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Jang Sung-ho and Oh Dae-sung straightened their ties, their hands hovering near the green folder that sat like a landmine between them. They had spent years in the inner circle, but they had forgotten that a lion is most dangerous when he is silent. Hyun-Woo entered first, his face a mask of unreadable stone. But it was the person following him that made the air vanish from the room. Little Ara, still wearing her light-colored sweater, walked beside the Mafia boss, her tiny hand tucked into his large, scarred palm. The two traitors exchanged a panicked glance. Their eyes widened, and Dae-sung instinctively covered his mouth, a silent gasp of guilt escaping him. They looked at the girl as if she were a ghost, realizing in a heartbeat that the invisible child had seen everything. "The contract is ready, boss," Sung-ho stammered, his voice trembling as he pushed the green folder forward. "Everything is in order for the $9 billion merger. Just one signature, and the future is ours." Hyun-Woo didn't sit. He looked at the folder, then down at Ara. "Ara," he said, his voice a low, melodic growl. "Is this the one?" Ara stepped forward, her heart thumping against her ribs like a trapped bird. She remembered her mother's voice telling her to always be honest. She pointed a small, steady finger at the folder labeled True Contract. "That's the folder," she whispered, her voice echoing in the dead silence. "But the papers inside are the gray ones. The white ones are in his pocket." The tension snapped like a dry branch. "She's just a child, boss." Oh Dae-sung cried, his face pale and slick with sweat. "She's confused. She's playing games." "Enough," Hyun-Woo barked. The word hit the room like a gunshot. He flipped the folder open. Inside lay the gray, forged documents, the fake contract that would have dismantled his legacy. He looked at his two most trusted men, his eyes burning with a terrifying clarity. He realized then that he had been blind, focusing on numbers, while the people he fed were sharpening their knives. With a slow, deliberate motion, Hyun-Woo reached out and snatched the real documents from Sung-ho's shaking hand. The traitor stood frozen, caught in the act of a $9 billion betrayal. The invisible girl had become the most powerful witness in Seoul, and as security moved in from the shadows, the final signature was not for a merger, but for the end of their lives as they knew it. The silence in the executive boardroom was heavy, thick with the scent of expensive cologne and the cold realization of ruin. Lee Hyun-Woo sat motionless at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the green folder that sat like a ticking bomb between him and his two most trusted lieutenants. Jang Sung-ho's face was a mask of wax, sweat beading at his hairline, while Oh Dae-sung's hands trembled so violently he had to hide them beneath the mahogany surface. "I trusted you with my life," Hyun-Woo said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate the very glass walls of the skyscraper. "I trusted you with the future of this empire. And you thought I was too blind to see you trading my blood for paper." Sung-ho tried to speak, his voice cracking. "Boss, it's just a child story. She's 5. She doesn't understand." "She understands more than you ever will," Hyun-Woo interrupted, his gaze shifting for a brief second to the doorway where little Era stood, clutching her mother's hand. "She understands that the truth is worth more than $9 billion. With a sharp nod from Hyun-Woo, the heavy double doors swung open. 2 uniformed officers entered, their presence an icy intrusion into the luxury of the suite. Behind them stood Hyun-Woo's personal security team, men who truly knew the meaning of loyalty. The click of handcuffs echoed like a gunshot. As Sung-ho and Dae-sung were led away, their protests falling on deaf ears, the room grew even quieter. Hyun-Woo stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Seoul skyline. For years, he had viewed this city as a chessboard and the people in it, including those who worked in his own home, as mere pieces to be moved or ignored. He had spent his life climbing to a height where he thought he could see everything, yet he had been utterly blind. He hadn't noticed the greed festering in his inner circle, and worse, he hadn't noticed the quiet, honest lives of the people who actually kept his world running. He turned back toward the room, his eyes landing on Hygiene and Era. The maid looked terrified, her shoulders hunched as if waiting for a blow, but Era's eyes were clear, reflecting a purity he hadn't encountered in decades. The cost of this betrayal was nearly the loss of his company, but the real cost was the realization of his own hollow existence. He had built a fortress of gold and glass, but it had taken a 5-year-old girl in a $10 sweater to show him that he was living in a house of cards. The betrayal was over, but the reconstruction of his own soul was only just beginning. The heavy, double-reinforced doors of the executive suite clicked shut, leaving a sudden, ringing silence in the room. Lee Hyun-Woo stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, but for the first time in a decade, he wasn't looking at the Seoul skyline or calculating his next move against the rival clans. He was looking at his own hands, then slowly turned his gaze toward the 2 figures huddled by the leather sofa. Hygiene, the woman who had scrubbed his floors for years, stood with her shoulders hunched, her hands trembling as she smoothed her daughter's hair. She looked ready to apologize for existing, ready to be swept back into the shadows where he had kept her for 7 years. Beside her, little Era gripped her mother's hand, her wide, innocent eyes darting between the scary man and the shiny star necklace he had just handed her. Hyun-Woo took a step forward, and instinctively, Hygiene flinched. The movement hit him like a physical blow. He realized that to her, he wasn't a visionary leader. He was a storm they were trying to survive. He stopped, intentionally softening his posture, and pulled out a chair. Not for himself, but for her. "Sit down, Hygiene," he said. His voice, usually a weapon of command, was gravelly and low. She hesitated, but as she sat, he didn't stand over her. He sat across from her, bringing himself to their level. For the first time, he didn't see a maid or a cleaner. He saw the exhaustion etched into the corners of her eyes. He saw the fierce, protective love in the way she held Era. He saw a person, "I've spent 20 years building walls of glass and steel," Hyun-Woo admitted, his eyes moving from the mother to the child who had just saved his life. "I thought that by looking down on everyone, I was seeing everything. But I was blind." He reached out, his hand hovering before gently patting Ara's shoulder. "Your daughter didn't just see a crime today.
She saw me.
She saw a man who had forgotten that the world is made of people, not just contracts." He looked Hyejin directly in the eyes, refusing to let her look away. "You are no longer a shadow in this house, and Ara is no longer invisible." In that quiet office, the cold corporate machine died, and a man was reborn, finally understanding that his true wealth wasn't in the $9 billion he had saved, but in the two souls sitting before him who had taught him how to see again. 6 months had passed since the whispered truth in the hallway, and the glass fortress of Hyun-Woo International Group no longer felt like a cold monument to power. Outside, the Seoul skyline was softening under the gentle touch of spring, but the most profound transformation was happening within the company's very soul. Lee Hyun-Woo stood at his window, but he wasn't looking at profit margins. He was watching the lobby below, where employees now walked with their heads held high, greeting one another by name. The culture of invisibility had been dismantled and replaced by a legacy of visibility. Hyun-Woo had realized that a $9 billion empire was hollow if the people building it felt like ghosts. He had implemented a sweeping new standard of dignity, ensuring that every support staff member, from the cleaners like Hyejin to the security guards, was treated as a vital foundation of the firm. The anonymous feedback systems and open-door policies weren't just corporate jargon, they were the new laws of his land. He had purged the old guard who viewed humans as machines, making it clear that loyalty was a two-way street. At the center of this new world was the Kim Ara Scholarship for Integrity. Hyun-Woo hadn't just secured Ara's future through college, he had turned her courage into a permanent institution. The scholarship was designed to honor children who demonstrated the same moral backbone Ara had shown when she faced the lion in his den. Hyejin, now a respected facilities coordinator, no longer had to choose between a paycheck and her daughter's safety. She watched from her new office as Ara, wearing a backpack adorned with sunflowers, high-fived the security guards on her way to the company's new after-school center. The weight that had bowed Hyejin's shoulders for years had finally vanished, replaced by a sense of belonging she never thought possible in a place so grand. Hyun-Woo turned from the window as a soft knock sounded at his door. It was Ara, skipping in with the same wide, honest eyes that had saved his empire. She held up a drawing of a large tree with many branches, each labeled with a name of a staff member she'd met. "Look, Mr. William," she chirped, using the informal name he now cherished. "Everyone is on the tree. No one is hiding." Hyun-Woo knelt to her level, a gesture that was now second nature to him. He realized then that he hadn't just rebuilt a company, he had built a community. He had spent 20 years chasing a view from the top, but it took a 5-year-old girl to show him that the most beautiful view was actually the one where you finally see the people standing right in front of you. He wasn't just a boss anymore, he was a guardian of the truth. As the sun begins to set over the city, painting the glass spires of Seoul in shades of deep amber and violet, a profound silence settles over the offices of Hyun-Woo International. The chaos of the arrests has faded, the sirens are distant echoes, and the $9 billion deal stands secure, not because of a complex security system, but because of a child's simple promise to her mother. Kim Ara's small voice has proven to be the most powerful force in the empire, teaching everyone in the building a lesson they will never forget. Courage has no age, and the smallest light can expose the deepest shadows. Lee Hyun-Woo stands at his window, watching Ara skip across the lobby below, her hand tucked safely in her mother's. He realizes now that real power isn't found in a bank balance or a signed contract. It is found in protecting those who are brave enough to speak the truth when the world expects them to stay silent. He was a man who had forgotten how to see the people around him, but a 5-year-old girl in a $10 sweater has saved more than his company. She has saved his soul. This story serves as a powerful reminder to all of us. No matter how small you feel, no matter how invisible the world tries to make you, your voice matters. Honesty is a superpower that can topple empires and redeem the lost. If Ara's courage touched your heart today, please hit the subscribe button to join our community and like this video to honor her bravery. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their truth is worth telling. We want to hear from you in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in Ara's shoes? Would you have found the strength to speak up? Don't forget to turn on post notifications so you never miss a moment of justice and redemption. Remember, like Ara, you should never stop shining.